episode number 76. You can get all the show notes and resources at dadhackers.us/076. What's up, Dad Hackers? My name is Patrick Antonucci, and I am the host and founder of this podcast and community of Dad Hackers. Dad Hackers is a community of Christian fathers who are devoted to encouraging, equipping, and enabling one another to become the men that God has created and called us to be, so that we can raise up the next generation of fully devoted followers of Christ and leave a legacy of multi-generational faithfulness. Now, on this show, we primarily interview Christian men to dive deep into their experiences and insights into what it means to be a Christian man, a Christian husband, a Christian father, and a Christian leader. We ask questions that dig deep into the thinking and rationale and experiences of these men so that we can all learn and grow into the men that God is calling us to be. I'm so thankful that you've joined us today. Make sure you subscribe so that you never miss any of our value-packed episodes. Also, please make sure you leave an honest review if you're listening to this in iTunes or any other platform that takes reviews. Reviews boost the show's ratings, which means that more dads are going to come across our show and benefit from the content that we put out. I also wanted to let you know that we do have a free private Facebook group just for Christian dads. So after the show, make sure you hop on over to the show notes. There's a link for that in there as well. All right, Scott, man, thank you so much for coming on the show today. How are you doing, brother?
Great. It's a pleasure to be here, Patrick.
All right, man. It's an honor to speak with you today. Well, Scott, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself? You're an author. You have a lot of things going on. And we're actually going to talk at length about your book today because it's some very, very important information that believers need to know about our faith. So, yeah, give us a little introduction. Tell us some background, about your family, and then we'll hop into some questions.
Sure. Well, I think one of the most important things to know about me is that I'm the son of a Holocaust survivor. My father, George, was rounded up not that long after his bar mitzvah in Svechna, Lithuania. And his father was murdered by the Nazis right then and there. And his brother was murdered. His uncles were murdered. And he was sent to a work camp. And wow. He survived the Holocaust when he was liberated in Dachau. And I can give a lot more details. But when he was liberated in Dachau, he weighed 60 pounds. And luckily he was liberated by, thank God, more than luckily, thank God he was liberated by the American forces. And at that time, they already knew that if you just gave survivors a candy bar or food, that they would just die. Their bodies could no longer tolerate food, or they would have insulin shock or a lot of things. So they nursed them back to health, and literally it took them a year. And
wow.
The United States, my father was always a patriot and so grateful to the United States for that. And he made it to the U.S. again because of the kindness of a individual in Chicago who didn't know my father from Adam, but signed that he would not be a burden on the U.S. taxpayer, and that if there was any issue, he would take care of it. And so he was brought in as a refugee, and he made his life in Chicago, married, and had a child, me. I'm his only son, only child. And I grew up it was a strange time because I grew up recognizing something important about my father, which is that he was one of those people who absolutely knew there was a God. It wasn't even a faith or a question issue, because he knew that if the slightest thing had happened differently, he would have been dead. So slight. Practically moving, one bottle from one place to another place, the slightest, smallest things. And so he knew that he was meant to be in Chicago and meant to have his life. But on the other hand, he was angry at God because His father was murdered. I mean, as I told you, his whole family was murdered. My closest relative is on my father's side is a second cousin once removed. That's as close as it in terms of survival of a big family. So he had that relationship of knowing there was a God and being angry that there was a God. And it took me a long, long time to figure out that my father gave God the silent treatment in some ways. And I came to learn that I think God understood that, and accepted it. And then I went on to, I went to college. I went to business school. I got a job on Wall Street where I got to experience what idolatry is firsthand. I got to move on to private equity. And then I had this idea to start a bank in New York, which I did with two other gentlemen. And we started Signature Bank in New York, which we grew from scratch to being today a pretty reasonable sized New York City bank. So, but faith has always been a part of what I am. It's part of my fabric. It's part of literally the fabric of my existence. Mm-hmm. And Judaism is an important part of me. And I wrote a book 12 years ago about the American Jewish community. And we'll talk about this more, I felt it was critical to write a book about religion, monotheism in our modern era in the United States and the Western world. And that's what In Good Faith was. So, and I'll wrap up here to say I spent every bit of my discretionary free time for 5 years writing this book. Because I thought it was
5 years.
That was that important.
Yeah. Yeah. It sounds like you're a pretty motivated guy with everything that you've done. And then on top of doing Signature Bank, you're sitting there writing a book in your quote free time or discretionary time, which I wouldn't imagine is very much, but sounds like you're very committed to it. So Scott, tell me,
driven as we all should be.
What was that?
You are too.
So I'm curious, Scott, what led you up to getting this passion to write the book In Good Faith? What led you up to that?
So two things. After I wrote my first book on the American Jewish community, I had people come to me who I knew from business. And they say something or another in the variety of, Scott, you look like a reasonable sort of guy. We do business. What is it that you care whether they're Jews, there aren't Jews? There's God. Isn't God just sort of Santa Claus and the Tooth Fairy, and we've all outgrown all that stuff? And it was common. It was a common reaction. I was surprised by it. And then I found other people who would come up and talk to me and say, I really believe in God, but I don't think it makes any sense. I have to sort of park my reason at the door. And I started to get into conversations with people. By the way, this would be, people from Jewish, Christian, and Muslim heritage. That's the good thing about being out in the business world is that I meet all sorts of people. And the other thing the believers would ask me constantly would be, how can I pass this on, my beliefs, on to my children? My children, I believe in whatever, monotheism, but my children, they think this is all bunk. And I kept having that conversation more and more and more. And it was sort of, I felt like it was a signal to me that I needed to take it seriously. And at first I looked for a book that would do that. That would explain why it's rational to believe in God with all we know about science, with all we know about the historicity of the Bible, and with our sense of modern morality. People pick out biblical passages and they say, oh, well, the Bible is immoral. We can't believe in that. And I just felt that this needed to be done. I looked for books. There are some, but I didn't feel that they met people where they were. In other words, many of the books, and there's a good number of Christian books, The Devil's Delusion, there's a lot of books that meet Christians where they are if they're already believers, but they don't necessarily meet skeptics. And so I worked really hard on my book to reach skeptics. So I sent drafts of my book to all sorts of people, but I was most interested in the comments from people who weren't believers, because I didn't want people to just open and close the book or not take it seriously. And so I really took those questions very seriously, and that's why I'm really happy that some people have told me at least that I've given them doubts about their doubts.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe they walk away from reading your book not having as much faith in their unbelief as they once thought they had, huh?
Right. That's right. I argue in the book there's two sorts of faith. There's good faith that nobody really knows. Nobody can prove everything they believe in. I mean, period. There's no human being that can prove everything they believe in. So we always take things a bit on faith, and there's good faith, believing in something that's rational, believing in things that are good, believing in things that can be true. And what I try to argue is bad faith, which is essentially in many cases idolatry, is believing in lies, believing in bad things, believing in things that are destructive. And I, in the book, try to explain what idolatry is. And I think that's really the key of what the Bible came to teach us, is whatever you do, avoid idolatry.
Right. I'm excited to have this conversation for a number of reasons. And one of them is that I hope some of the things that we talk about will help equip dads to have a firmer foundation in why it's rational to believe in the one God, the one true God, and then be equipped to arm their children with the same rational belief in God. You talk about these two kinds of faith, and I think sometimes, I know in Christianity, people can develop a good faith in a rational God, but their faith has no undergirding. It's irrational. It's all based on feeling and experience. And then they try to pass that on to their children, and it has no rational basis. They're not able to give a good reason for the hope that they have. Or I even see this with wives or husbands who have married an unbeliever, and they're trying to convince their husband to, quote, go to church and believe in God. But their faith is all based on feelings and experiences, and they're trying to tell their husband, I just feel this, and I get a sensation, and the husband's probably looking at his wife like, kind of cult did you get into? So I say all that, Scott, to ask the question, and you kind of hinted at it, but why is it rational to believe in the one true God? Why is that a rational thing?
Right. So here's the thing, and if I could step back for a minute, because
Sure.
I'd like to explain what's not rational, because we'll use that as a foil, if you will.
Sure.
So what I do is define idolatry the way the Bible does, but it doesn't do it in so many words, because the thing that people lose track of is the Bible conveys what it wants via stories. But if you boil it down and you read the Exodus story, the Bible essentially says that idolatry is a set of lies about power. It's about ascribing super authority or superpower to finite beings, people like us, ideologies, or natural processes, or in the ancient world to some degree animals, not so much in the modern world. So we somehow think And this is the core that people don't get. We somehow think that we licked the God King Pharaoh 3,300 years ago with the Exodus. But the reality is that God King Pharaohs, on a macro basis, the whole 20th century was a catalog of God King Pharaohs. Mao, Stalin, Hitler, Pol Pot, the Assad family, the Kim family. I can go on and on.
Right.
How did Stalin convince and have the authority somehow to kill all the kulaks, to murder all the kulaks, to starve a quarter of the Ukraine, and to send tens of millions to the gulag or worse, and never was questioned? People followed his rules. He found that he used the same tropes as all the other God King pharaohs. He used poetry, pageantry, theater, myths, all of course backed up with demonstrations of brutality. And he acted just like a God King. He famously had his image broadcast into space by the Soviet Space Agency. And yet, and here's the other thing we lose track of. It's not just about the macro, it's about the micro. How did Harvey Weinstein, Charlie Rose, Matt Lauer, and Kevin Spacey, and the list goes on and on, get people to do all sorts of things and were able to abuse all sorts of people? That's because they set themselves up in a certain way as idols. They didn't have superpowers, but they had super authority over people's careers, over whether they would get roles, not get roles, which they would use for their own whim. Because don't forget, being an idol means, being a God King means that you can kill who you wish to kill, steal from who you wish to steal from, abuse who you wish to abuse. There's no rationality, but there's plenty of rationality in their own mind, but there's no set of moral standards. And the Bible teaches us that idols can be toppled. God kings can be toppled. I mean, they are human in the end, but it's very difficult. It takes a lot of courage. Don't forget, you know very well, but the whole story of the Exodus starts with the two Egyptian midwives essentially resisting Pharaoh, who says, throw the Israelite babies into the river. It would have been so easy for them to do that, or not throw them in, kill them actually at the birthing stool. And it would have been so easy for them to just kill the Israelite baby boys. And Pharaoh said truth, but they had the understanding there was a bigger moral requirement. Yeah. And then Pharaoh's daughter, all she had to do was avert her gaze for a minute after the Egyptians were throwing babies into the Nile. Pharaoh's daughter, must have known that was an Israelite baby, but she didn't avert her gaze. Such power it takes to stand up to idolatry. And by the way, the Egyptian midwives knew they could be killed by Pharaoh, and the daughter of Pharaoh knew because she was Pharaoh's daughter didn't mean she was immune. She could be killed, which was common in royalty in those days, and even sadly in not so long ago. So idolatry is really, really bad. It becomes endemic and infects all of a society. Lies become truth, and it's believing in bad faith that Pharaoh is the God King. It's believing in bad faith that communism is an ideology which is worth killing tens of millions. Famously, Mao said, if it took 30 million, if you had to kill 300 million Chinese to make sure that communism took hold in China, that was worth it. The ideology, these bad faith ideologies, are worth more than human values. So what do we believe in good faith? Now I've set up the model of bad faith, and there's a lot of it. We can get into this in any detail. And people are probably thinking of other examples of bad faith.
Right.
So what is good faith? Whether you're a believer, and bad faith, let me just say one more thing, is irrational. It is irrational to believe that Stalin or Pharaoh or Kevin Spacey or Harvey Weinstein are gods and untouchable. They are. They ultimately are human beings. What is good faith? whether you believe or you don't believe in God, it is rational to believe in a in a infinite power that stands also outside of our universe, that gave us a moral set of standards. That's why we don't view, that's why we as monotheists view God as being outside and essentially creating our universe. So that's a rational belief. I can't prove it. We can talk about why it's rational. I can't prove it, but there's nothing irrational about it. It's not believing in an ideology like communism or fascism, or believing in a God, King, Pharaoh, whatever you want to call them. So I argue at its core, faith is good faith. Faith in a monotheistic God is rational.
Okay, so let me try to rephrase this in my own words to make sure I'm understanding the concept. You're saying that it makes sense, I guess, to believe in God, because if you consider the world around you, we're all just human beings. We all exist. And kind of therefore it makes sense to at least allow for the fact that something bigger and outside of ourselves created us and is in power and authority over us. And then it sounded like you are kind of using part of the moral argument for the existence of God in there by talking about how he has given us a set of moral values that are, I mean, if you look around the world and across cultures, there's typically a set of moral values that everybody kind of intrinsically agrees upon. But where'd that come from? You know what I mean?
So here's where you get I've made the case, I've tried to make the case that it's rational to believe in God.
Right.
Talking about why I think God is more likely, and I think the evidence for God is more likely than not, actually gets into some other chapters, the science chapter, and where I think it's actually easier to make that case. Look, and we'll get into this later. Atheists, it's very intellectually awkward to be an atheist in many ways. They have a lot of questions to answer. Believers essentially have one question to answer, which is the existence of evil. And we'll get to that. I mean, that's the hard question for believers. Understanding the creation of the universe, evolution, all that actually isn't as hard. But what I would like to say is that what differentiates, and the stunning idea that the Bible gave right from the beginning, is that we're all created in the image of God. That's right up front. B'Tselem Elokim in Hebrew, in the image of God. We all have that divine spark. Because before the Bible came to say that to us, don't forget, every idolatrous society that pre-existed the Bible did not believe that. They thought, I've got to take care of my God King, and if I have to wipe out the neighboring country, I'm going to do that. And you know what? Their lives don't even count. They're not anything like me because they believe in this other God King. I mean, there was no compunction about not only destroying the neighboring group, but you wanted also to destroy their God because they were all wrapped up into that.
Mm-hmm.
And it ties into the whole notion of the golden rule, which is what I think is the core for all good monotheists, which is Hillel stated 2,000 years ago, and it restated in the new. It's in the Hebrew scriptures. Hillel restated it. Jesus restated it. But Hillel's formulation is the one I keep closest to my heart, even above the scripture one, because it's the easiest one for me to remember, is don't do unto others as you wouldn't want them to do unto you. The rest is commentary. Go learn it. That was his definition for the entire Bible. If you know nothing else and you live by that, you're going to be a good monotheist. Idolaters don't think that way. They think, and whether they're Harvey Weinstein or one of those dictator tyrants, they think that the only thing that matters is them. There isn't a golden rule. What's good for them is good. what's not good for them isn't good. And it doesn't matter what happens to anybody else. I found people on Wall Street who would self-deify themselves. They would think the only thing that was important for them, if they could mess up with a client, if they could take from a partner, as long as they didn't get caught, as long as they could keep it secret, or as long as the harmed party couldn't retaliate, that was okay. That's the exact opposite of monotheism. That's why I keep setting up this duality between idolatry bad, monotheism good.
Yeah. So kind of what I hear you saying with reference to the golden rule is that the golden rule, the basis of the golden rule is the fact that we are all created in the image of God. Therefore, it doesn't make sense for any human being to treat any other human being less than they would want to be treated, because we're all made in the image of God. But then when idolatry creeps in, it makes it okay to treat other people differently because they're essentially not made in the image of God. And we have a benevolent God that looks over us and cares for us and has given us life. And therefore, since we're all made in his image, we should have one another's best interests in mind. Is that kind of encapsulating what you were describing?
By saying that you are created in the image of God, and I don't have any right to judge you. I have no right to say, to make any judgment as to your value, because I can't see what God can see. I don't have the God's eye view. I can't. I'm a finite being. But I know you have that spark. And therefore that makes it incumbent upon me, honestly, to have certain responsibilities towards you. And presumably you as a believer feel you have certain responsibilities toward me and toward everyone else. So that's the key. And people lose track of the fact that did not exist before the Bible. Nobody thought that way.
Yeah, that's interesting. You mentioned that atheists have quite a dilemma because they have so many questions to answer, but believers essentially have one question to answer, and that's the problem of evil. And I'd like to get into that, but I just want to know and we don't have to get in super detail about these, but what are some of the questions that that give atheists trouble, the questions that they have to answer?
Well, the truth of the matter is, I wrote the book. I hope people read it from start to finish, but I find that people have questions. And so I tried to make the chapters sort of so you could look at the names of the chapters and figure out the big questions. So the questions that people have about evil is, the first one that I get is, isn't the Bible evil? What about the Bible and genocide? What about the Bible and the death penalty? What about sexism in the Bible? Where do we get our morality from the Bible? And then I get a lot of questions about determinism and not having free will. I don't know if you're following this, but a big thing within the atheist framework is that we don't have free will. Therefore, how can we have morality? And they, will pull out functional MRIs and the like and say, well, this is all predetermined. And a big question is, of course, why do bad things happen to good people? Why do natural disasters why do natural disasters? I mean, again, sadly, we're reading about flooding. We're in what happened in the Bahamas, a terrible tragedy with just an unconscionable, we can't imagine number of people killed, even still missing. There are great tragedies, the tsunamis. And so I get that question a lot, is if you believe in a good God, how can they let that child suffer? How can this person get this disease? How can that plane crash? And that's the truthfully, when I'm engaged in longer conversations with atheists, I actually get a sense from some, not all, but some, because I'm attuned to this from my father, that it's not that they don't necessarily believe in God, but they are angry at God too. They're angry at the notion that a God could let this happen. And, Mark Twain said it. He said, if there is a God, he's a malign thug. And he was pretty good at capturing a lot in a few words.
Right.
And so I find that I talk about that. I thought when I went on book tour that I was going to talk a lot more about creation and the evolution, which is a part of my book. It's a section of my book. It's section 4, and the historicity of the Bible. I find that I'm talking a lot about evil and good, and the other thing I'm surprised I'm talking so much about in terms of getting the questions is prayer, because the other thing people say is to me, which is the next question after, well, you believe in this good God, is there evil? They say, well, why do you bother to pray if God knows everything and has a plan? Well, we don't have free will. We're just actors, doing our lines. So what is prayer all about? And I get that question a lot too from younger people, because they were taught to sort of pray in a way that turns God more into a cosmic vending machine than what we have to do in prayer.
Yeah, excellent point. Yeah, I think a lot of people approach God like you mentioned, the guys that you would meet in business in Wall Street just thought of him as some big Santa Claus in the sky fairy tale type of being. So whenever we're trying to equip our children, or if they come home from college and have these questions, or even for our own general knowledge,
Yes.
how do you handle the problem of evil? I mean, that's the question. How can a good God let bad things happen to people who are good? How do you handle that, Scott?
So there's a couple of levels to that, and we're not going to be able to hand out all.
Yeah.
I'm going to give really tops of the waves on some of this. So let me go back and let me reference both. Let me reference the Holocaust. Did the Holocaust have to happen? And the answer is there's a lot that human beings could have done to stop the Holocaust. I mean, people in the United States, there was intelligence that the government had. There's a whole book buried by the New York Times that recounts just how much the New York Times knew and how little it was reported, how much the U.S. government knew and didn't do anything, how much all of the allies knew and didn't do anything. And early on, there were times it could have been stopped. I mean, don't forget that in the beginning, Hitler didn't want to kill Jews. He was willing to let them go anywhere that they would be taken. And the rest of the world said no. Famously, the Canadian prime minister at the time, when asked to take a few Jews, from Germany, said, no Jews is too many. So it's a famous quote. I mean, unfortunately, easily Googleable. And I look at, and I just, again, hitting the tops of the waves, look at the story in the book of Esther. The Jews there were sentenced to death by Haman, and with the acquiescence of Ahasuerus, the king. And what happens, most people are just confused. It says everybody's confused if you read the text. And they're not going to do anything in a certain kind of way. A lot of the non-Jewish bystanders are just confused. It uses the word nebuchad. They don't even know what to do, but they're not going to engage. Mordechai is one who says, I got to come up with a plan. And he reaches out to Esther, who, strangely enough, and against all odds, happens to be in a spot where she can do something. And what is her first reaction? It's to avert her gaze. I can't do anything. The king hasn't called for me in 30 days. And what does Mordechai say to him, which changes the whole story? He says, you can do something, he says, and don't think that you weren't potentially put in this spot of being queen just for this purpose so that you could do something. But if you don't do anything, ultimately there will be some relief and redemption to the Jews. We won't all be wiped out. But as for you and your family, you've got no hope. And that presses the button for her, because she realizes that she has to take a chance. What does she do? She calls on the Jews to fast for 3 days and pray, which she does too. So you've got to get God on your side. And interestingly enough, the book of Esther doesn't mention the name of God at all, but God is there, and it's in the Bible. So there's, something going on. And then she comes up with a plan that requires an awful lot of coincidences.
Right.
Kidnapping, not to sleep at night. I mean, it goes on, an awful lot of coincidences. And my feeling is, it's more than my feeling. My belief is that when we figure out how to combat evil, when we stand up to the test, and the Bible is full of tests, most of which people fail. But when we see the test, take the test, engage with God, pray, we get a tailwind. And we get all those funny coincidences. Without the name of God, there's no parting of the Red Seas and the Reed Sea, should I say, in the book of Esther. But she ends up saving everybody. Now, had she not done that, I believe, and the Bible essentially says, ultimately everybody won't be wiped out. But a lot of Israelites could have been, and a lot of Jews could have been wiped out. And that's what we're asked to do. So ultimately, even in the Holocaust, it could have been, there were people in positions of power in the United States and elsewhere that knew what was going on before, could have taken all of the Jews. They all could have moved to Alaska. They all could have moved somewhere. And yet that didn't happen. And because we didn't partner with God. So when we're merciful, I think God is our partner and he's merciful. When we're not merciful, I think God does have to stand aside and let us have free will. I'll give you an example. So I keep kosher, so I don't eat, cheese and milk, cheese and meat, or milk and meat, and it has to be kosher meat. If I took a cheeseburger and bit into it, and a lightning bolt struck me down, well, I think most people would be not eating cheeseburgers, at least most Jews. We'd recognize that we had no free will. God lets us have free will. That's our test. If we all had no free will, if every time we did something bad, if every time you did something bad, a lightning bolt struck down at you, well, you would lose your humanity. You would become an automaton. Good people and bad people would both toe the line because they would have no choice. They'd have no choice. They don't want to be struck down by a lightning bolt. And so that's how I think we can explain a lot of the problem of human evil, is by recognizing that we have free will. That means it's incumbent on us to raise good children who do the right thing, who stand up, who don't avert their gaze, just like those Egyptian midwives. They are there when they need to be there. And if we do that, God gives us a tailwind. He really does. Now, and if you want me to go into it next, you want to pause there, we can talk about this, evil that's not human evil, like disease and natural disasters. But I don't want to go too ahead of the story if you want to pause there and probe.
Yeah. So as you were talking, and I'm reconciling everything you're saying, it made me go back to the Garden of Eden with Adam and Eve, and how God essentially gave them a choice. He gave them free will to eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil or not.
Yes. Satan
comes in, tempts them. They do eat from it. So therefore, sin and death enter the world. And so, are you essentially saying that because sin has entered the world and people have free will, that this is why there's a lot of the evil that exists in the world is basically boils down to the fact that there's sin and free will kind of coming together and producing all this evil, pain, and suffering.
So let's look. I think I love those verses that you're citing, the beginning of the Bible, because there's so many powerful allegories there. So we're all created in the image of God. And then what happens in the Garden of Eden? The Garden of Eden's, and I think that these lines are critical because it's line, and I don't have my reading glasses on. I want to make sure that I'm getting the line right. But I think it's verse 29. And it says, God says, you're in the Garden of Eden. You humans can eat anything that grows there, any fruit, any vegetable. And then what does he say to the animals? He says to the animals, this is a powerful allegory. He says that you can only eat the vegetables. That's what it says. Nobody pays a lot of attention to the line, so to those verses. But what it mean, what's going on here is this really is the sacred space. It's a space where there are no predators. No predators. Now, it's interesting that the snake character, what does he want? Why does the snake character care about all of this? I mean, what is he coming to do? And really, it goes to another core sin. He's resentful. He resents, the snake character, Nachash in Hebrew, is resentful. He can't eat the fruits. So he tries to get the humans to eat the fruit, the forbidden fruits, in the thought that he can eat the fruits, eat fruits too. You know, if he can get the humans to start eating fruits, he can eat the forbidden fruits, because they're only forbidden a couple of fruits in the whole garden. He's forbidden all the fruits. And so that motivation is resentment. And that's such a powerful allegory, because most times bad interpersonal relations happen due to some sort of resentment, which again goes against that golden rule. I mean, even, I don't want to, keep even, Nazis resented the Jews in a certain way. There was a lot on an interpersonal basis. A lot of bad stuff happens when people resent. So what happened? We were cast out of the Garden of Eden, and now they're predators. I mean, in a certain kind of way, resentment, it was from resentment that all the bad stuff happened, because no longer would it just be that we'd all be herbivores. Now they were carnivores. And now everything sort of was, after the Garden of Eden, it was sort of like everything was, we were in a blender with the top off. And so I think your point is very well taken. Very, very well taken. It boils down to that resentment, not treating each other as we'd want ourselves treated. And the interesting thing is what was the first chapter of the Bible is all about perfect creation. Mm-hmm. And the interesting thing is that the snake knows he can't defeat God, but he can defeat God's people, the human beings. And so that's what he does. And it's actually a really good strategy. It worked. I mean, the score at the end of chapter 3, sadly, of this affair is God 0, snake 1. If you really look at it, he won because he used that resentment. Well, why can't we eat that apple or that fruit? There isn't an apple, by the way. That's nowhere in the Hebrew. Right. About an apple. But why can't we eat that fruit? It sets it up and for the rest of history where we're resenting each other.
Yeah, that's a very interesting take on the Genesis account. I'd never really looked at it from the standpoint of the animals. I always just think of what happens with Adam and Eve. Scott, for for the time that we have remaining, I want to make sure that we touch on how to talk to kids.
Yes.
Particularly to equip them for whenever they go out into the real world. And we were talking before the show, before the recording, that you talk to a lot of parents of children who go to college and they come back after a semester of college having renounced their faith. And I'd like to get some of your input on how we as dads can better equip our children to face the challenges that they're going to face in college, and also for our own knowledge, so that we have maybe some answers for when they do come back.
Yeah, it's the issue, because we don't want faith to end with with our generation, or else we're really condemned as a civilization. So the first part is you've got to do your homework. It's not enough to say believe because I believe. I've heard so many people who have told me that, and it's just a strategy that doesn't work. So you have to be able to explain, well, where does the Bible conflict with science? And is there anything to that? And so you have to do a little bit of work. You have to understand that science has a set of tenets. It's a methodology based on observed reality, based on experimentation, and based on data and empirical data. And what I try to say is, look, there is no way that science has proved that the universe was not created by God. Indeed, and if we had the time, I would make the argument that it's a much simpler, frankly, much more coherent explanation that God created the universe. I personally believe God created the universe 13.8 billion years ago. Rabbi Yitzhak Avako, writing 1,000 years ago, thought the universe was created 15.3 billion years ago. He did his own calculation. Oregon, the early Christian father, Augustine of Hippo, another early Christian father, thought that too. They read the Bible that way, that the God created the world a long time ago. We don't know how long. And I frankly take people through evolution, and again, I can't summarize the whole argument in the context of this conversation, but I think people need to take the time to sit down and learn that, which is part of the reason, as I said, for my book, I wrote with the chapter headings, because sometimes people have immediate critical chapters. I mean, I've talked to moms and dads who get the phone call, I just learned that, this belief in the creation of God is superstition, or I just learned that evolution disproves God. And so sometimes you need that immediate fire extinguisher, because both of those are wrong. Or the Bible was written by lots of people, some Babylonian priests, and there was no Moses, there were no prophets, this was all made up. And so you need, again, that's why I wrote the chapter headings, because sometimes people need that immediate fire extinguisher. But it's better to have those conversations up front. Why is what we believe rational? And prepare kids before they get to college to not be immediately thrown off when someone says that you're just following the superstitions of your parents, because there's no reason to be bashful. There's no reason to shrink. Some parents I know shrink from the conversation. One thing that I think is great about you is you say have conversations. Don't avoid the conversation. It's unfortunately the parents who say they're afraid to have the conversation about God, about why it's rational to believe in God, that I find have the most problems, because their children end up thinking that there is no answer. This is just sort of what my parents believe, but it's bunk. and some of them will even go through the motions with their parents, but then afterward will just, because they love their parents. Kids still love their parents whether they become believers or not.
Yeah.
But they'll just say, okay, whatever, and they don't believe. But that's not a way to pass on our belief. And I actually think, I was talking about the notion of idolatry. I actually think the message of the Bible is more relevant today perhaps than ever. We need the Bible, and we need to read the Bible. The other thing I learned, which is I was surprised at, I didn't realize it, but I've learned when I've gone to campuses and the like, that the less people know about the Bible, the less they like it.
Yeah, I wouldn't doubt that. And you bring up a good point. I think sometimes parents mistakenly think it's wise to try to not influence their children too much when it comes to God, and kind of, quote, let them come to their own decision and let them believe what they want to believe. And I would argue that's almost immoral, because what you're doing is essentially not teaching your kids about the rationality of God and the good reasons of why the Bible, it has the authority it has, and why we believe what we believe in the Bible, and why the Bible is trustworthy, and why it makes sense to believe in God. And to withhold that information from your child is immoral, because then they cannot make an educated decision. And then when they get, quote, educated in college by these atheist professors who have permeated every single college, and many of the Christian colleges and many of the private colleges, they get educated there by them, and they're educated with all the wrong, quote, air quotes, big time facts about atheism. So I think I very much promote having these conversations with your kids, and also living the beliefs that you believe. You talk a lot about the golden rule. As dads, we need to be living that in our home, not just Sunday when we go to church, but every day in every context, not just at home, not just at public, not just at work. Every time we need to be treating others as they are, which is creations of God made in His image.
I'm a big believer, and I hope I tried to model this for my kids, that a lot of morality is caught, not taught. They need to watch their parents, be consistent. Right.
Yeah, that's a huge concept for me, and something I personally try to work on all the time, is being consistent, because if you don't work on it, it's very easy to be inconsistent.
It is hard. I'm a father of 4. They will tell you it's hard. I try. I definitely try hard.
Yeah. Well, Scott, it's been an excellent conversation, man. I could talk to you for a long time, and I don't even think we got through half of the things that I wanted to bring up. But I mean, people are just going to have to get the book. And I like how you label the chapter headings. I mean, you could read the book from front to back, cover to cover, or you could kind of jump in there and get the little fire extinguisher pieces that you need, like you call it, if there's an immediate need, or if there's a topic that's very relevant to someone at this time. Scott, if people want to connect with you or what you're doing, or grab a copy of your book, of course, I'll link it up in the show notes, but what's the best way they could do that?
Well, they can go to scottshay.com. S-H-A-Y is the way I spell my last name, scottshay.com. And there are links to talks, and I'm going to be thrilled to feature this link.
Awesome.
There's a contact sheet, so people can reach out. They can get in touch with me, and I do get a lot of emails.
I bet.
So I'm happy to do that. They can contact me through that. And there are actually churches and synagogues right now using a study guide to the book, and that's downloadable on the website as well. People are using the study guide, and it's a pleasure. I mean, part of the book, because I wanted to make this a book accessible to everybody, I spoke along with others to 6 Christian faith leaders, and I wanted to get their ideas in my book as well. So I clearly write from a Jewish perspective, but we share the Bible, we share the Hebrew scriptures, and I think that's so basic right now. We've got to get at these questions as believers.
Amen, brother. Well, Scott, it's been a real pleasure speaking with you. I got one last question I like to ask all my guests this. And in your opinion, what makes a great dad? It's kind of totally changing the subject, but I always like to hear the different answers that my different guests have to that question. So what's yours, Scott? Well,
the number one thing is showing up and listening. And I will tell you the one lesson, and frequently the Bible tells us things so that we know what not to do.
Yeah.
So Moses, the greatest, probably, the greatest Jew of the Hebrew scriptures, goes to save the Jews, and then what happens? He leads them out, and his father-in-law has to come with his wife and kids because he sort of was so busy he forgot about them to some degree. I mean, he didn't forget, but he didn't have time for them. And then we read, with Eli, and he doesn't really take the time, do what he needs to do to raise his children. In the book of Samuel, the people come and say, Samuel, you're a great prophet, but your kids are not so great. You didn't spend any time with them, raising them up. And it goes on, and we read the whole book of Kings. The good kings frequently don't raise good children because they're so busy. They don't show up. And we see that. I can go on for the next half hour giving you biblical examples of where the...
None of you are coming to mind as you're saying those things, yeah.
And we got to be there. People sometimes don't get that the Bible says stuff to us, not because it's all good. And the narrator lets you know it's not good. The narration, should I say, lets you know that it's not good. It does in the Bible story. Look back that, Peter is saying, and if you read it carefully, well, here are your kids, you need the tonation. And the Bible's saying, well, Moses, you're a really, really great man, and you've got to raise these kids too. And Samuel, you were a really, really great man, etc. David, the first real conversation between David and Solomon is that we read about is on his deathbed, on David's deathbed. Mm. And Solomon goes off at the end to the deep end to a certain degree. I mean, even though he was. So raising kids is important. Avshalom, David never speaks to David never really speaks to Amnon or Avshalom, who both cause major problems.
Right.
And again, dads have to show up, even if they're really, really great, and convey that to their kids. And that's why I love the Bible so much. I mean, we could go on and on. The lessons are so many in biblical parenting.
Yeah, they really are. Well, thanks again, Scott. I just want to say thank you again for everything you've shared, and especially for the answer to the question at the end about showing up. I think a lot of dads, including myself, need to hear that because it's so easy to get caught up in our own thing and forget that one of our primary ministries is to our children. So,
amen.
So thank you very much, Scott. I appreciate you coming on today, brother.
Thank you.
All right, gentlemen, that's all we have for today. Thank you so much for tuning in. I hope our conversation was a blessing to you and that you leave this episode better equipped to be the man and the father God has called and created you to be. If so, then I ask that you please leave us a 5-star rating and a quick written review in iTunes. Then make sure you head on over to the show notes to get all of the resources for this episode. While you're there, you can take part in our 5 Days to Be a Better Dad challenge, as well as get involved with our free Facebook community. All right, gentlemen, until next week, remember Proverbs 27:17. As iron sharpens iron, so one man sharpens another. Stay sharp.